In just a few months, the 14-year reign of Michael D. Higgins as President of Ireland will come to an end, and the race to fill the highest office in the land has barely even started. As of the making of this video, just 2 candidates have been nominated to run for election, though a number of others have declared their interest, most notably Conor McGregor. The former UFC champion was paraded to journalists at the White House by Donald Trump on St. Patrick's Day and interviewed by Tucker Carlson at a Masonic temple in Dublin a month later, hyping up a presidential bid that he has been hinting at since 2023. But McGregor's chances of even making it onto the ballot paper are slim to say the very least. Once so respected by the Irish people that the British tried to steal him from us, McGregor's reputation now lies in tatters, following a spate of violent incidents, with a poll around the time of the Carlson interview showing that he would receive only about 7% support in a presidential election. This hasn't curtailed McGregor's ambition, however. On Twitter.com, he frequently posts about what he will do as President of Ireland, from holding the government to account to dissolving the Irish Parliament when he sees fit, introducing measures to end the cost of living crisis, curtail immigration, and integrate Bitcoin into the public finances. The only problem, as many have tried to point out to him, is that the Irish President doesn't have the power to do any of these things, and is little more than a symbolic figurehead. McGregor has hit back, however, that the head of state has immense power, and that his team of constitutional lawyers will cut through the government lies that say otherwise. So as this year's presidential election coincides with the 50th anniversary of the death of Éamon de Valera, the man who created the Irish presidency, I'm going to examine how the office came into being, what powers it has, and what, if such a thing ever came to pass, a McGregor presidency would look like.
Stand your base! Stand your base! The space is your space, yeah? Go ahead, carry on.
First, we'll need to examine the President's spiritual predecessor, the Governor-General. Under the Constitution of the Irish Free State, the British King formed part of the Oireachtas, or legislature, along with the Dáil and the Seanad. The King's functions in Ireland, however, were handled by the Governor-General, such as summoning and dissolving the Dáil, signing bills passed by the houses of the Oireachtas to give them royal assent, and appointing the President of the Executive Council, the head of government elected by the Dáil, as well as the members of their cabinet. In 1932, Éamon de Valera, who had opposed the Anglo-Irish Treaty that brought the Free State into existence, was elected as President of the Executive Council and immediately set about dismantling the Constitution. You can check out my video on the economic war for more on that. He attempted to abolish the office of Governor-General after demanding the resignation of its incumbent, James McNeill, but as his support in the Dáil began to waver, de Valera was forced to appoint a successor so that he could control the timing of a general election. De Valera's appointee, Donal assisted in diminishing the office, and in 1936, in the midst of the abdication crisis, he signed an act abolishing the position entirely. The President of the Executive Council would now be automatically appointed on election by the Dáil. They would then automatically appoint the Executive Council and direct the Ceann Comhairle, or Speaker, to dissolve or convene the Parliament. The Ceann Comhairle would also take on the duty of signing bills into law. This state of affairs didn't last for very long, however, as de Valera was already preparing a new constitution, Bunreacht na hÉireann, which came into force on the 29th of December 1937. The head of government would now be called the Taoiseach, and a brand new office was created, President of Ireland. The President would be invested with most of the functions previously held by the British monarch and exercised by the Governor-General, all except for one. The External Relations Act, introduced during the abdication crisis, granted the King the power to appoint diplomats and conclude agreements on the advice of the Irish government. As a result, some legal scholars argue that the King would technically remain head of state until the Republic of Ireland Act came into force in 1949, transferring the last of the monarch's responsibilities to the Irish President. To date, all presidents have had extensive legal, political, or academic careers and have come to the job with a thorough understanding of the limits, or intended limits, of the office. While some may have gently pushed the boundaries, none have sought to radically reform the presidency or engage in open conflict with the sitting government. But as Irish politics continues to fracture, and as well-known figures from outside the traditional big parties become more common on the ballot papers, some have begun to wonder what could happen if a president went rogue. We can consider how much power they might have and how they could be stopped through the hypothetical reign of President Conor McGregor. First, McGregor would need to make it onto the ballot paper, and as already mentioned, this is highly unlikely. To do so, he would need to be nominated by at least 20 members of the houses of the Oireachtas. Members of the larger parties won't break ranks and put forward someone who isn't approved by the party, so McGregor will have to try and muster support from independents, especially members of the Seanad. De Valera had abolished the Free State Seanad in 1936 for opposing his constitutional reforms, and the one established in his own constitution was influenced by corporatist policies promoted by Pope Pius XI. Senators are nominated to one of 5 vocational panels by representative bodies, and are then elected by members of local authorities and the Oireachtas. The Taoiseach also appoints a number of senators, usually members of their own party who fail to get elected to the Dáil. Before sending a picture of his presidential seal of office to Azalea Banks, McGregor posted on Twitter that he was looking for Senator Sharon Keoghan to nominate him for election, but she hasn't commented on this so far. As I was making this video, Michael Flatley announced that he was seeking a nomination, and the 4 TD strong Independent Ireland group said that they would support him if he had a realistic chance of getting the other 16 votes. Members of the Oireachtas can only subscribe to one presidential nomination, so it's likely those outside the major parties will wait to see who comes forward and what their level of support is before committing themselves. Few, however, would want to be associated with McGregor, and none have expressed any interest in nominating him so far. The other path to the presidency is to secure the nomination of 4 local authorities. Specific days will be set aside for potential candidates to address these councils, and it's to the ones with large numbers of independents and members of small parties that McGregor, Flatley and others will turn if they don't get Oireachtas support. And due to his toxic reputation, it's unlikely anyone in the Oireachtas or local government will support McGregor, and he seems to know this, telling Tucker Carlson that the nominations process was controlled by government parties and party affiliates. While larger parties do have an easier route to getting their candidates on the ballot, local authorities have grown increasingly important in putting forward voices from outside the mainstream political system in recent elections. The 1997 contest featured the first ever candidates to receive local authority nominations, and a majority of those who ran in the last 2 elections got on the ballot this way. Indeed, the runners-up in those elections were local authority picks. When McGregor fails to get a nomination, it'll be hard to argue that local councillors are closing ranks around the political elite, but I'm sure he'll try. And even if McGregor did make it onto the ballot, his massive unpopularity, outside of Irish Americans on social media, means that he'd likely poll in the mid-single digits on a good day. So to keep the video from ending here, we're going to have to imagine a scenario in which McGregor somehow makes it onto the ballot and is the only candidate to survive an Irish dancing mishap by Michael Flatley during a televised debate. With the nominations closed, McGregor would thus be elected President of Ireland, unopposed. The Constitution would immediately be brought to bear on his business interests, as the President cannot hold any position or job that they profit from. While he could serve as patron of non-profit or charitable organisations, McGregor would have to resign from any paid positions, and likely sell assets such as his pubs or transfer them into a trust. The intention here is to uphold the dignity of the office, and to prevent the President using their position for financial gain. The article on emolument is based on the equivalent article in the US Constitution, but we've seen how little that has done to stop the current occupant of the White House from prioritising his and his family's finances. Speaking of big white houses, after being sworn in at Dublin Castle, McGregor and his family would be expected to move into Áras an Uachtaráin, the official residence of the President in the Phoenix Park. The Constitution states that the President will have an official residence near the city of Dublin, and the first President, Douglas Hyde, was installed temporarily in the Vice-Regal Lodge, previously home of the Governor-General and the Lord Lieutenant. The intention was that the former hunting lodge would be demolished and replaced with a more modern structure, but this never happened, and after many expensive renovations, the Áras, as it is now known, has become inextricably linked with the presidency. But as the Áras is owned by the Irish state and managed by the Office of Public Works, there will be no paving over the gardens, no massive flagpoles, and no impromptu car sales.
Everything's computer.
There are a number of articles in the Constitution governing the powers of the President, but the most important is undoubtedly Article 13.9. The powers and functions conferred on the President by this Constitution shall be exercisable and performable by him only on the advice of the government. There are a few exceptions to this, but one interpretation is that the President can't even speak without the permission of the government. With this limitation in mind, let's consider some of McGregor's statements and see if they have any basis in reality. First, McGregor and his supporters believe that the President has the power to dissolve the Dáil, the lower house of the Oireachtas made up of Teachtaí Dála, directly elected by the Irish people. The President does indeed dissolve the Dáil, leading to the holding of a general election, but only on the advice of the Taoiseach. The President cannot dissolve the Dáil otherwise and must dissolve it when advised to do so. The only exception to this is where the Taoiseach has lost the support of the Dáil. In such a situation, the President can, using their absolute discretion, refuse, forcing the Taoiseach to resign and allowing an opportunity for a new government to be formed. No president has yet exercised this power, but in 1982, members of Fianna Fáil, notably Brian Lenihan, attempted to contact the Irish President and former Fianna Fáil Minister Patrick Hillery, when the Fine Gael-led government of Dr. Garret FitzGerald lost the support of the Dáil. They wanted Hillery to refuse FitzGerald's request to call an election, instead giving the Fianna Fáil leader Charles Haughey a chance to form a new government. The dissolution was granted and Haughey won the ensuing election anyway, but the attempt to pressure the President came to the surface in 1990, when Lenihan ran to succeed Hillery. Though he had been a favourite to win, the controversy contributed to his defeat and the election of Mary Robinson, who would begin the modern expansion of the office. Whenever the Dáil elects a new Taoiseach, the President must appoint them to that position and present them with their seal of office. The Taoiseach then nominates a government, which the President must again appoint. A member of the government can present their resignation to the Taoiseach for submission to the President, which they must accept, and the Taoiseach can request a member of the government to resign. If they refuse to do so, the Taoiseach can advise the President to terminate that minister's appointment. The President cannot carry out any of these functions without the advice of the Taoiseach, and has no ability to influence or determine any government appointee. McGregor has also stated that he will hold the government to account, summoning the heads of the Dáil, the Garda Commissioner and government ministers, specifically the Minister for Finance, to discuss, learn and implement cuts to any non-serving public interest organisations. Here again, there is a fundamental misunderstanding of the actual provisions in the Constitution. The President cannot summon individual members of the government, but the article covering the functions of the government states that the Taoiseach shall keep the President generally informed on matters of domestic and international policy. This is both to keep the President aware of upcoming legislation and anything that might impact visits planned by or to them, but it's also a courtesy to the office, and the failure of Liam Cosgrave to keep Cruel O'Dolig informed led to severe tensions between the government and the President. The President has no power to influence or shape policy, though the Taoiseach might take their suggestions into account, so I'm sure Micheál Martin will love hearing about why the government should dump the euro and start using Bitcoin. Now, while they can't summon ministers randomly, the President can, at any time, after consultation with the Council of State, convene a meeting of either or both houses of the Oireachtas. The Council of State consists of a number of sitting legal and political figures, such as the Taoiseach and the Attorney-General, all former Presidents, Taoiseach and Chief Justices, and up to 7 people appointed by the President. During the drafting of the Constitution, the Department of Finance argued that the wording here was confused, as the President would be expected to act on the advice of the government, but the mention of the Council of State implied that such advice could be disregarded. The power to convene the Houses was intended to be used in an emergency and has never been exercised to date, but gives a rogue President the opportunity to disrupt the functioning of the Oireachtas by convening it at will. More commonly used is the President's ability, again after consultation with the Council of State, to communicate with the Houses of the Oireachtas by message, or to address a message to the nation. In both cases, the President's statement must have received the prior approval of the government. Recent presidents, however, have increasingly made informal statements without government approval, seen by some as skirting the intent of the Constitution, if not openly breaching it. Following her victory over Brian Lenihan, Mary Robinson adopted a notably more expansive version of the presidency, highlighting issues relating to the Irish diaspora, peace in Northern Ireland, and the less privileged. While one of her special advisors stated that there was no limit to what she could discuss in interviews as long as it is not government business or the Constitution, the Attorney-General declared that the President had no right to say anything in public without first securing the permission of the government. Robinson's more expansive interpretation would eventually win out, and the President has now become a significant voice in public discourse, where once they were expected to keep quiet. Michael D. Higgins, for example, denounced the housing crisis as a disaster in 2022, which was viewed as an unconstitutional criticism of government policy and performance. How far the President can actually push the boundaries of the Constitution in their public pronouncements is yet to be tested.
Look, come on, you know what we want. Say on TV.
Another powerful-sounding but largely symbolic function of the President is the signing into law of legislation sent to them by the Oireachtas. The President can send a bill to the Supreme Court if they believe it to be unconstitutional, but if it is found not to be, then they must sign it. Only 15 bills have ever been referred to the Supreme Court, 7 of which were found to be unconstitutional. Most famously, in 1976, President Cúil Ó Dóigh referred the Emergency Powers Bill that was introduced following the killing of the British ambassador to Ireland by the IRA. It was found to be constitutional and Ó Dóigh signed it into law, but the government was furious that the President had delayed the bill in the first place. The Minister for Defence went so far as to describe Ó Dóigh as a thundering disgrace to a reporter, and with relations between the President and the government already strained, Ó Dóigh resigned as he felt that the dignity and independence of the presidency had been attacked. In recent elections, candidates have been quizzed on what they would do if presented with a bill that they did not agree with. In 2011, Dana Rosemary Scallon said that she would refuse to sign a bill that threatened the Constitution, and Mary Davies seemed to suggest that she would consider referring a money bill to the Supreme Court. Money bills, however, such as budgets, are exempt from the President's suspensory veto and must be signed by them. Now, a rogue president might just refuse to sign a bill anyway or refer a money bill to the Supreme Court, but this would open them up to charges of misbehaviour for which they could be impeached. Before looking into this though, we'll consider some of the other restrictions that are placed on the President. I've highlighted a few ways in which McGregor could cause trouble for the government if elected, but he might just keep his head down and focus on training for his next big fight. 2026 marks the United States' 250th anniversary, and to celebrate, both the UFC and Donald Trump have indicated that a massive championship fight will be held on the lawn of the White House, which McGregor has committed to taking part in as President of Ireland. The Constitution, however, prevents the President from leaving the state without the permission of the government. The main aim here is to make sure that the President is on hand to sign legislation or dissolve the Dáil if needed, but it also prevents the President from undertaking trips which might cause diplomatic complications for the government, or reflect poorly on the office. You know, like taking part in a fistfight at a used car dealership.
Everything's computer.
No president has had this constraint wielded against them more than Mary Robinson. She was blocked from travelling to give a lecture in Britain in 1991, from travelling to the United States in 1993 to chair a committee on UN reform, and she was only allowed to travel to the University of Cambridge to receive an honorary degree because no one in the government realised that Prince Philip was its Chancellor. Diplomatic relations between Ireland and the United Kingdom were still strained by the War of Independence, never mind the ongoing troubles. Articles 2 and 3 of the Irish Constitution asserted that Northern Ireland was part of the national territory, and British officials refused to use the President's full title, President of Ireland, to address them. Robinson was allowed by the government to meet with Queen Elizabeth in 1993 for tea at Buckingham Palace, but only in a private capacity. They insisted it was not an official or state visit, as that would have required the offer of a return visit in the opposite direction, something that wouldn't happen for 20 years. The President is also expected to seek government advice before declining invitations that have been extended to them, and can be advised to take trips that they wouldn't want to in normal circumstances. So instead of a championship fight in the United States, McGregor would most likely be sent on a trade junket to Japan. Or just made stay at home. If the President were to cause enough of a nuisance by refusing to sign bills or travelling without government permission, there is a cumbersome impeachment process in place that could be used to remove them. A charge of misbehaviour can be made against the President by either of the houses of the Oireachtas, but it has to be put forward by at least 30 members of that house and then supported by a 2/3 majority. The other house of the Oireachtas would then investigate the charge and pass, by another 2/3 majority, a resolution declaring the President unfit to continue in office. This procedure raises a number of questions, specifically relating to the investigation into the charge against the President, as the Constitution states that they are not answerable to the Oireachtas or any court for any act done by them in the exercise and performance of their duties. Under the Constitution, the state pledges itself to safeguard with a special care the economic interests of the weaker sections of the community. Could a president refuse to sign or refer to the Supreme Court an austerity budget that they believes conflicts with this pledge, putting their actions beyond the criticism of the Oireachtas? If such a scenario were ever to occur, constitutional lawyers would no doubt become national celebrities, appearing on The Late Late Show and every podcast going, but in most cases the government would simply turn to Article 14. This allows for a 3-person commission to act in the event of the President's death, incapacity, or their failure to exercise and perform the powers and functions of their office. Consisting of the Chief Justice and the Speakers of both houses of the Oireachtas, this commission could sign a bill if the President refused to do so, without the need to remove them from office. And even if a President were to be impeached, there is nothing to stop them from running again, but their re-election and re-impeachment would be considered the end of their second term, the max a person can serve as President. And so, banned from fighting for the glory of Ireland at the White House and threatened with impeachment if he keeps advertising cryospray to foreign diplomats, President McGregor would no doubt feel tempted to invoke his position as Supreme Commander of the Defence Forces to stage a military coup. It's a grandiose-sounding title and is a little more than just that. The actual Supreme Command is regulated by law, meaning it is carried out by the Department of Defence and its Minister. The President has an important function in signing the commissions presented to officers of the Defence Forces, but has no ability to influence those choices, or to issue orders to the army. The idea of the President threatening the democratic functioning of the state probably sounds ridiculous, but this was a very real fear by the opposition parties during the drafting of the Constitution. John A. Costello believed the provision that allowed for further powers to be granted to the President by law could be used to create a virtual dictatorship by a government in collaboration with the President. At the time, Fianna Fáil held a majority in the Dáil, and many believed that de Valera would run for President after the Constitution was enacted. The crux of the issue was that as these new powers were conferred by law and not the Constitution, the President would not need the advice of the government to exercise them. This had not been de Valera's intent. He was fairly upset during Dáil debates when the Constitution was described as dictatorial, and added to the final draft a clause that the President would also need government advice to carry out functions conferred on them in this way. Deep in the weeds of the Constitution, there are a number of other powers and duties the President has which have never been carried out. There's a convoluted process whereby members of the Oireachtas can petition them not to sign a bill into law and instead have the people vote on it at a referendum, and the President would formally remove a judge from office if ever presented with a resolution from the Oireachtas calling on them to be impeached. By now, we can see that most of the President's powers are procedural, such as signing bills, symbolic, such as being First Citizen of the State and Supreme Commander of the Defence Forces, and almost entirely dependent on the advice of the government. No doubt a man of Conor McGregor's energy would feel constrained by the office, and, just like Mary Robinson before him, resign, so as to contribute his talents in a more dynamic sphere, like bare-knuckle boxing promotions. Conor McGregor has called for a democratic process to play out, where Oireachtas or local authorities who don't support him would add him to the ballot anyway and let the people have their say. The people of Ireland would issue McGregor with a resounding rejection, but his public profile and the potential for interference by the likes of Elon Musk, who he met in the White House, contributed to the Irish government shelving plans for a directly elected mayor of Dublin. An office with a smaller electorate and much more authority than the presidency. This is seen as a more feasible route to political power for the likes of McGregor or figures unconnected to the political centre. The Dáil would also be a much more feasible option if McGregor has serious political ambitions. Peter Casey won over 340,000 votes to finish a distant second in the 2018 presidential election, but the convicted criminal Gerry Hutch narrowly missed out on a seat at the last general election with just over 5,000 votes. A seat on the opposition benches behind Danny Healy-Rae, however, is a whole lot less prestigious than Áras an Uachtaráin.
I believe that God above is in charge of the weather.
Considering the limited powers but considerable expense of the office, some have asked if Ireland even needs a president, including the 1967 Committee on the Constitution, which was divided on the matter. The 1937 Constitution has been described as a rebottling of wine, with the powers of the British King and Governor-General decanted into a bottle marked President of Ireland. These powers were temporarily taken over by the government between the abdication crisis and the enactment of the new constitution, and as their advice is needed by the president anyway, what difference would it make to just get rid of them? The presidency envisaged by de Valera and the team he appointed to draft the constitution was one which provided democratic stability, sitting for up to 14 years, while governments and the Taoiseach that led them rose and fell and, as of more recent, rotated. First citizen of the state and guardian of the constitution, they would stand as a non-political representative of the nation and the only official elected by the Irish people as a whole. And when the constitution was being drafted, such a figure was badly needed. One of the main concerns expressed by the opposition at the time was the transfer of supreme command of the Defence Forces from the Executive Council to the President, which TD Cecil Lavery in particular saw as a potential threat to the state. In response, the Minister for Finance, Sean McEntee, declared that the actual operation of the Defence Forces would still be regulated by law, meaning that little had changed from the Free State Constitution, but explained that the supreme command of the Defence Forces is vested in the President in order definitely and for all time to take the army in this country out of the arena of politics. A decade and a half after a brutal civil war, involving many of the men now screaming accusations of dictatorship across the Dáil at each other, the symbolic command of the army that had prosecuted that war would be placed in the hands of a non-political head of state. Many of the revolutionary generation would never be reconciled to the state that emerged from that revolution, but in the President, the drafters of the Constitution sought to create a unifying influence that would paper over the wounds of the Civil War and represent all of the Irish people. We could argue that the President has served their task well, but is no longer needed, with the Civil War now just a distant memory and its two major inheritors in coalition together. But without prompting, and just before Civil War politics started to wane in importance, a new spate of expansionist presidents began to transform the office. Mary Robinson placed a candle in the window of the Orus, lighting the way for a diaspora largely created when the ultimate failure of de Valera's economic policies were revealed in the 1970s. Northern Ireland-born Mary McAleese would preside over the Good Friday Agreement and continue normalising formal relations between Ireland and the United Kingdom. Michael D. Higgins would complete this process, making the first ever state visit by an Irish head of state to Britain, while highlighting the pain felt by a large portion of the population following the economic crash that preceded and then marred the entirety of his presidency. All three would be accused of breaching the spirit, the intent, and the limits of the Constitution, and of stepping on the toes of the governments that tried to hold them in check. Some desire to see the presidency return to its former role as little more than a retirement home for distinguished public servants prepared to sign bills and keep quiet, while others expect that the next head of state will continue pushing the boundaries and representing the opinions of the majority, even if that alienates the minority. There are also calls for voting rights to be extended to Irish citizens living abroad, or at least those in Northern Ireland, who can run for the office but not vote. 50 years on from the death of Éamon de Valera, the presidency he created is at a crossroads, but it's unlikely that Conor McGregor's interpretation will be given much of a hearing.